Admiral Cole stood on the bridge of her flagship when the first distress signal arrived. The message was broken and filled with static, but the words were clear enough. Earth was under attack. She turned to her communications officer, Lieutenant Commander Daniel Shaw. His face had gone pale as more signals flooded in. Each one carried worse news than the last. Orbital defense platforms destroyed. Major cities in flames. Millions dead in the first hour alone. Walked to the main display screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she activated the visual feed from Earth. What she saw made her heart stop. The planet she had called home for the first 30 years of her life was burning. Great columns of smoke rose from every continent. The beautiful blue and green world had become a sphere of fire and ash. The attackers were the Dominion. Humanity had barely any contact with this species. They lived on the far side of the galaxy and kept to themselves. There had been no warning, no declaration of war, no demands or ultimatums. They had simply appeared in Earth's orbit with a massive fleet and begun killing. Daniel played back the final transmission from the Planetary Defense Headquarters. A young officer was speaking rapidly, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. She reported that enemy ships numbered in the thousands. Their weapons were cutting through shields like paper. Evacuation shuttles were launching, but there was not enough time. The transmission ended with a flash of white light. Closed her eyes. Her mother lived in a small town on the coast of Maine. She was 87 years old and refused to leave the house where she had raised her children. There was no way she had made it to an evacuation shuttle, knew with terrible certainty that her mother was dead. The bridge was silent. Every officer stared at the screens showing the destruction of there. Some had tears running down their faces. Others looked frozen in shock, understood their pain. She felt it too, like a knife twisting in her chest. But grief would have to wait. She had work to do. She opened a channel to Fleet Commander Perry at the military headquarters on Titan. The old man's face appeared on screen. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. His eyes were red, but his voice was firm. Told her what she already knew. They had withdrawn after completing their attack. 4 billion humans were confirmed dead. The number would rise as rescue teams reached the surface. Earth was not destroyed, but it would take centuries to recover from this devastation. Asked the question that was burning in her mind. What was the response going to be? Leaned forward. His expression hardened into something cold and determined. Every human colony had already been contacted. Every military vessel was being recalled. The Galactic Union had offered condolences but refused to intervene. They feared thee and wanted no part in this conflict. Humanity would stand alone. That was fine with. Humanity had always been good at standing alone. Over the following days, ships began arriving at the staging point near Neptune. Destroyers and cruisers came first, followed by battleships and carriers. Colony defense forces sent everything they could spare. Even civilian vessels were converted into military transports. Watched the numbers climb on her tactical display. 10,000 ships, then 50,000, then 100,000. Still they kept coming. The anger of humanity was gathering like a storm. Captain Maria Vance arrived with her destroyer, the Swift Current. She was an old friend of S and one of the finest tactical minds in the fleet. Maria's brother had been visiting Earth when the attack came. He had not survived. Maria found in her private quarters. The Admiral was staring at a photograph of her mother. Maria sat beside her without speaking. There were no words that could help. They simply sat together in their shared grief. Finally spoke. She said that she had always believed humanity was past this kind of hatred. They had spread across the stars and built great things. They had made peace with dozens of alien species. She thought the days of total war were behind them. Maria replied that they had reminded humanity of something important. When threatened with extinction, humans did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They fought back with everything they had. nodded slowly. She put away the photograph and stood. There was work to be done. The fleet continued to grow. By the end of the month, nearly 900,000 warships had gathered. It was the largest military force ever assembled by any species in galactic history. The sight of it filled with grim satisfaction. Fleet Commander Perry arrived to address the assembled commanders. He stood before them with his shoulders straight despite his years. He spoke of what had been lost. He spoke of the children who would never grow up and the families that had been torn apart. He spoke of the beautiful world that had given birth to humanity and now lay in ruins. Then he spoke of what came next. The fleet would travel to space. The journey would take nearly a year. When they arrived, they would make the understand the consequences of what they had done. This was not about conquest or territory. This was about justice. This was about making certain that no species would ever again think that attacking humanity came without a price. The commanders listened in silence. When finished, there was no applause, no cheering, only a deep and terrible determination that filled every heart. Was given command of the vanguard. She would lead the first wave of ships into enemy territory. It was an honor she accepted without hesitation. On the day of departure, she addressed her own fleet through a broadcast that reached every ship. Her voice was calm and steady. She told them that they carried the memory of 4 billion souls with them. They carried the hopes of every human who survived. They carried the weight of grief and the fire of vengeance. But she also told them to remember who they were. They were not mindless killers. They were not monsters. They were human beings seeking justice for an unforgivable crime. When the time came, they would act with purpose and precision. The fleet moved out from Neptune's orbit. 900,000 ships, stretching across millions of kilometers of space, stood on her bridge and watched them go. The stars seemed dim compared to the lights of all those engines burning bright. She thought of her mother one last time. She whispered a promise that the old woman would be avenged. Then she turned her attention forward. The long journey to space had begun. The journey to space would take 11 months. Had commanded long missions before, but nothing on this scale. Moving 900,000 warships across the galaxy was a task that had never been attempted. Logistics Chief became one of the most important people in the fleet. She was a short woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her job was to keep the armada fed, fueled, and armed. It was an impossible task, and she somehow made it work. Explained the challenges to during their first meeting. The fleet consumed more resources in a single day than most colonies used in a year. Food alone required thousands of supply ships running constant routes back to human territory. Fuel was even more critical. Without it, the warships would become floating metal coffins in the void between stars. Gave whatever she needed. The mission could not fail because of empty stomachs or dry fuel tanks. The first 2 months passed without incident. The fleet moved through neutral space, following routes that avoided the territory of other species. Word of their mission had spread throughout the galaxy. Other civilizations watched them pass with a mixture of fear and fascination. No one tried to stop them. Commander Brooks served as Chief Intelligence Officer. He was a quiet man who spent most of his time analyzing data and reading intercepted communications. What he learned about the troubled him deeply. Requested a private meeting with. He brought files containing everything humanity knew about the Dominion. It was not much, but it painted a disturbing picture. They were ancient. Their civilization was over 50,000 years old, far older than any human nation. They had once been explorers and traders, spreading across their region of the galaxy. Then something changed. About 3 centuries ago, they sealed their borders and cut off contact with the outside universe. Asked what had caused this change. Explained that records from that period were scarce, but it appeared they had suffered some kind of catastrophe, a plague or natural disaster that nearly wiped them out. The survivors became paranoid and isolated. They viewed all outsiders as potential threats. This explained the attack on Earth, but it did not excuse it. Thanked for the information and told him to continue his research. Understanding the enemy was important, but it would not change the fleet's mission. The fourth month brought the first contact with forces. A patrol of scout ships appeared on the edge of sensor range. They were fast and well-armed, clearly watching the approaching human fleet. Captain Maria Vance volunteered to lead the response. Her destroyer squadron was the fastest in the fleet, and she knew how to handle small engagements. Approved the mission. Maria's ship swept forward like hunting dogs chasing prey. The scouts tried to run, but they were too slow. The swift current caught the lead scout and destroyed it with a single volley of missiles. The remaining scouts scattered, but none escaped. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. It was a minor victory, but it lifted spirits throughout the fleet. For the first time since leaving Neptune, humans had struck back against the enemy. However, warned that the scouts had transmitted data before they died. The Now knew exactly how large the human fleet was. They would be preparing their defenses. Was not worried, let them prepare, let them see what was coming for them. The months continued to pass. Life aboard the warships settled into a routine. Crews trained constantly, running battle simulations and practicing damage control. They sharpened themselves into weapons. Chaplain Lisa Morgan traveled between ships, offering comfort to those who needed it. She was a gentle woman with a kind face and a voice that could calm the most troubled soul. Many crew members had lost family in the attack on Earth. The grief was still raw, even after all these months. Lisa reported that morale was complicated. The crews were motivated and determined, but the nature of their motivation varied. Some wanted justice. Others wanted pure revenge. A few wanted nothing less than the complete destruction of the species. Understood this. She felt the pull of darker emotions herself. When she closed her eyes, she still saw Earth burning. She still heard her mother's voice in her memories. The desire for blood was strong. But she also remembered what she had told her fleet before departure. They were not monsters. They were seeking justice, not genocide. Keeping that distinction clear would be the challenge of this mission. In the 8th month, the fleet received a transmission from the Galactic Union. The message was formal and filled with diplomatic language, but its meaning was simple. The Union demanded that humanity turn back. They had powerful allies. This war could spread across the galaxy and destabilize the entire political order. Read the message twice. Then she deleted it without responding. The Union had done nothing while Earth burned. Their warnings meant nothing now. Daniel Shaw noticed the Admiral's expression as she deleted the message. He asked if she was worried about the Union's threats. Shook her head. She said that the Union was afraid. They had built their entire system on the idea that major wars could be prevented through diplomacy and treaties. Humanity's fleet proved that some crimes could not be settled with words. The 10th month arrived. The fleet was now deep in previously unexplored territory. They were getting close to space. Long-range sensors detected artificial structures ahead, defense platforms, weapons installations, the enemy border. Called her senior commanders together for a final briefing. Reported that supplies were holding steady but would become critical after 2 more months of heavy combat. Brooks presented his latest intelligence on defenses. They were substantial but not invincible. Maria Vance outlined tactical approaches for breaking through the border fortifications. The meeting lasted for hours. Every detail was examined. Every contingency was planned. When it finally ended, felt ready. That night she stood alone on the observation deck of her flagship. The stars stretched out before her, cold and indifferent to the affairs of living creatures. Somewhere ahead, beyond those distant points of light, lay the enemy. Thought about what was coming. Thousands of her people would die in the battles ahead. Perhaps she would die as well, but the fleet would not stop. It would not turn back. The debt of blood would be paid. She stayed on the observation deck until the ship's lights dimmed for the night cycle. Then she went to her quarters and slept without dreams. Tomorrow they would cross the border. The real war was about to begin. The border defenses stretched across an entire star system. Massive fortress stations floated in the void, bristling with weapons. Minefields covered the approaches like invisible spider webs. Automated weapons platforms waited silently for targets to appear. Study the display on her bridge. The enemy had built well. These defenses had protected space for centuries. No invader had ever broken through. That was about to change. She gave the order. The first wave of human ships surged forward. They were the expendable vessels, old destroyers and converted freighters loaded with countermeasures. Their job was to clear paths through the minefields and absorb the first volleys from the defensive platforms. The space ahead erupted into fire. Mines detonated in brilliant flashes. Weapons platforms opened fire with beams of concentrated energy. Human ships began to die. Watch the casualty reports scroll across her screen. Each number represented a ship. Each ship held hundreds of crew. They were dying by the thousands, and the battle had barely begun. But the human fleet did not stop. More ships poured into the gaps created by the first wave. They returned fire against the weapons platforms, overwhelming them with sheer volume of missiles and energy beams. One by one, the automated defenses went dark. Maria Vance led her destroyer squadron through a weak point in the defensive line. Her tactical instincts were flawless. She had spotted a section where the power grid was overloaded, causing the weapons platforms to fire more slowly. Her ships raced through before the enemy could respond. Once behind the line, Maria's squadron attacked the power nodes that fed the defensive network. Explosions rippled across the system as station after station lost power. The carefully constructed defensive grid began to collapse. The fortress stations were harder targets. They were enormous structures crewed by thousands of soldiers. Their weapons could destroy a human battleship with a single shot, assigned entire battle groups to deal with each fortress. The fighting around the fortresses was brutal. Human ships swarmed the massive stations, pouring fire into their shields. Defenders fought back with desperate determination. Both sides took terrible losses. By the end of the first day, 2 of the 5 fortress stations had been destroyed. The remaining 3 were heavily damaged and pulling back to secondary positions. The border was broken. Brooks brought an intercepted communication from the High Command. The enemy commanders were confused. They had expected humanity to negotiate. They had expected demands and threats, followed by diplomatic talks. The idea that a species would send nearly 1,000,000 ships simply to fight was beyond their understanding. Allowed herself a small, grim smile. They were beginning to realize what they had awakened. The fleet pushed deeper into enemy territory. They encountered more resistance at every step. Warships engaged them in running battles. Ground forces on conquered stations fought to the last soldier. The enemy was brave, admitted to herself. They simply did not have enough ships to stop the human advance. On the 3rd day, the fleet encountered something unexpected. A convoy of civilian transport ships was fleeing toward the inner colonies. They were slow and unarmed, packed with families trying to escape the war zone. Officers looked to her for orders. Some wanted to destroy the transports. Enemy civilians today could become enemy soldiers tomorrow. Others argued that attacking unarmed refugees would make humanity no better than the. Made her decision quickly. She ordered the transports scanned for weapons. When the scans came back negative, she ordered the convoy released. The civilian ships were allowed to continue their journey unmolested. Captain Gregory of the battleship Iron Will voiced his disagreement openly. He said that they had shown no mercy to human civilians. Why should humanity show mercy to theirs? Looked at him with cold eyes. She said that they had come to punish those responsible for the attack on Earth. Children and families running from war were not responsible. If Gregory wanted to murder innocents, he could do it without her fleet. Gregory backed down. The matter was settled, but found herself thinking about his words late that night. The desire for revenge was a fire that could easily burn out of control. She had to keep her fleet focused on justice, not slaughter. The distinction mattered, even if some of her captains did not understand why. The High Council sent a message on the fifth day. They offered to surrender the military commanders who had ordered the attack on Earth. These officers would face human justice. In exchange, the fleet would withdraw from space. Read the offer carefully. It was tempting. The officers who killed her mother would pay for their crime. The war could end quickly, saving countless lives on both sides. But something felt wrong. She discussed the offer with Daniel Shaw. Daniel pointed out that the offer addressed only the immediate crime. It did nothing to change the system that had produced that crime. They would remain isolated and paranoid. In another century, they might attack humanity again, or some other innocent species. Nodded slowly. The war could not end with a simple exchange of prisoners. Something more fundamental had to change. She sent her response to the High Council. The offer was insufficient. The fleet would continue its advance. Delivered her supply report that evening. The news was not good. The fleet had lost over 40,000 ships in the fighting so far. Millions of human lives had been spent. Supplies were being consumed faster than expected. They had perhaps 2 months of sustained combat remaining before critical shortages would force a withdrawal. Accepted the report without comment. 2 months would have to be enough. The fleet pressed on. They reached the inner colonies by the end of the second week. What they found there changed everything. Long-range sensors revealed massive refugee camps on the colony worlds. Millions of civilians huddled in temporary shelters, looking up at the sky filled with human warships. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary people caught in a war they did not start and could not stop. Stared at the images for a long time. She thought about Earth. She thought about the 4 billion humans who had died. She thought about her mother. Then she thought about those children in the camps. They were afraid. They were innocent, and they were completely at her mercy. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Made a decision that many of her officers considered insane. She ordered ground teams to land on one of the refugee worlds and make direct contact with civilians. Commander Brooks volunteered to lead the mission personally. He had spent months studying the enemy. Now he wanted to meet them face to face. The shuttle landed in a field outside the largest refugee camp, stepped out with a small team of soldiers and translators. Thousands watched them from behind makeshift fences. Their large eyes reflected fear and something else that could not identify. They were tall and thin, with gray skin and 4 arms. They moved with a grace that seemed almost liquid. Their faces were difficult for humans to read, but had studied their body language. He could see terror in the way they held themselves. An elder approached the fence. He wore simple robes and carried no weapons. Through the translator, he asked if the humans had come to kill them. Told him no, they had come to talk. The elder seemed surprised. He introduced himself as coordinator, a historian and teacher. He invited inside the camp to speak further. Accepted, ignoring the worried looks from his security team. Inside the camp, saw the reality of civilian life. Families huddled in crowded shelters. Children played in the dirt, watched by exhausted parents. Medical stations were overwhelmed with the sick and injured. It looked like every refugee camp in human history. Led to a quiet corner where they could talk. The old began to explain things that had only guessed at before. 3 centuries ago, a terrible plague had swept through space. Billions died. Entire worlds were abandoned. The civilization that had existed before was essentially destroyed. The survivors rebuilt, but they were forever changed by the experience. Fear became the foundation of their society. The government taught that outside species had created the plague as a weapon. Isolation was the only path to safety. Any contact with aliens was treated as a potential invasion. The military grew powerful. Diplomats disappeared. Asked about the attack on Earth, why had they killed 4 billion innocent people? Lowered his head in what recognized as shame. 3 years before the attack, a human colony ship had accidentally entered territory. It was destroyed immediately, but the military commanders convinced themselves that it was a scout for an invasion fleet. They decided to strike first, before humanity could attack them. The attack on Earth was not hatred, explained. It was fear taken to its most terrible extreme. Returned to the flagship and reported everything too. She listened in silence, her face revealing nothing. When he finished, she dismissed him and sat alone in her quarters for hours. The revelation did not excuse what they had done. 4 billion humans were still dead. Her mother was still gone, but understanding changed things. The enemy was not evil in the way she had imagined. They were afraid. They had let their fear transform them into monsters. Wondered if humanity was doing the same thing. The next morning, she received a transmission from the Supreme Council. Their tone had changed. The earlier arrogance was gone. They were willing to discuss full surrender, but they begged for assurance that their species would not be destroyed. Called a meeting of her senior officers. The debate that followed was the most heated of the entire campaign. Captain Gregory spoke for the hard-line position. They had proven themselves dangerous. As long as they existed, they were a threat. The only safe choice was complete destruction of their military capability and occupation of their worlds. Chaplain Lisa Morgan argued the opposite view. Genocide was not justice. It was merely another atrocity. If humanity destroyed they would become the very thing they were fighting against. Maria Vance took a middle position. The military had to be dismantled. Their leaders had to face consequences, but ordinary civilians had done nothing wrong. Punishing them for the crimes of their government was not honorable. Let the debate continue for hours. She wanted every perspective heard. When the officers finally fell silent, she thanked them and ended the meeting without announcing her decision. That night she walked through the medical bay of her flagship. The wounded filled every bed. Some had burns covering most of their bodies. Others had lost limbs. A young woman with bandages over her eyes called out for her mother. She would never see again. Stopped beside each bed. She looked at the faces of those who had suffered for this mission. Their sacrifice demanded results. But what kind of results? She thought about the refugee camps on the colonies. She thought about the children playing in the dirt. She thought about, and his words about fear. She thought about her mother, who had taught elementary school for 40 years. Her mother had believed that every person deserved a chance to become better. Even the worst student could learn if given patience and understanding. Sat down on an empty bed and put her head in her hands. For the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to cry. Daniel Shaw found her there an hour later. He sat beside her without speaking. When she finally looked up, he asked what she was going to do. Wiped her eyes. She said that she knew what her mother would want. She knew what humanity should be, even if it was hard. She had made her decision. The next morning, she broadcast a message to the entire fleet. Her voice was calm and steady, just as it had been when they left Neptune so many months ago. She told them that they had accomplished what they set out to do. The military was broken. The species that had attacked Earth now begged for mercy. Vengeance had been achieved. But now they faced a choice. They could destroy them completely. They could become killers of civilians and murderers of children, or they could show that humanity was better than that. She would not order the destruction of a species. Any captain who disagreed was free to challenge her command. The fleet was silent. No challenges came. nodded to herself. It was time to end this war. There was a planet of silver towers and ancient forests. Had seen images of it in intelligence files, but nothing prepared her for the real thing. It was beautiful in a way that made her heart ache. Her shuttle descended through the atmosphere with only a small escort. Daniel Shaw sat beside her, nervously checking his sidearm. Maria Vance commanded the security detail, her hand never far from her weapon. Told them both to relax. If they wanted to kill her, they could have done it already. This meeting would determine the future of two civilizations. Assassination would serve no one. The shuttle landed in a plaza at the center of the capital city. Thousands of lined the streets, watching in silence as the human delegation emerged, walked with her head held high. She would not show fear to those who had murdered her world. The Supreme Council waited in their great hall. It was an enormous chamber with walls that rose hundreds of meters toward a domed ceiling painted with stars. The architecture was designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Was not impressed. She had commanded 900,000 warships across the galaxy. A fancy building did not intimidate her. The council members sat on elevated platforms, looking down at the human delegation. Their leader, High Coordinator, was ancient even by standards. His gray skin had faded to almost white, and his 4 arms trembled with age. Welcome to their world. His voice was soft but carried clearly through the hall. He expressed hope that they could find a path to peace. Stepped forward, she had prepared no speech. The words came from her heart. She told them what humanity had lost. 4 billion lives, countless families destroyed, a world that had nurtured their species since the beginning. Earth would recover someday, but the scars would never fully heal. She told them what humanity had brought to their doorstep. 900,000 warships, the fire of vengeance burning in every human heart, the power to destroy every world just as Earth had been destroyed. But then she told them what humanity had chosen not to do. They had released civilian transports. They had landed in refugee camps with open hands instead of weapons. They had come to this hall to negotiate instead of simply taking what they wanted. Humanity had proven that it could be terrible in its wrath. Now it would prove that it could also be merciful. Presented her terms. The military commanders who ordered the attack on Earth would face trial. They would be held accountable for their crimes. They would pay reparations to help rebuild human colonies. The cost would be significant but not crippling. Most importantly, they would open their borders. They would rejoin the galactic community. They would trade and communicate and interact with other species. The isolation that had bred their fear would end. The council members stirred uneasily, raised a trembling hand for silence. He asked why humanity was demanding this final term. What did open borders have to do with justice? Answered honestly. She said that isolation had made them afraid. Fear had led them to attack Earth. If nothing changed, the same fear would lead to more atrocities in the future. The cycle had to be broken. She did not threaten them. She did not need to. The human fleet still orbited their world. The threat was visible every night in their sky. The council debated for hours, waited patiently. She had traveled for nearly a year to reach this moment. She could wait a few more hours. Finally, a voice spoke from the public gallery. It was Coordinator. The historian had met in the refugee camp. He had been given permission to address the council. Spoke of his conversations with the humans. He described what he had learned about them. They were not the monsters that propaganda had portrayed. They were people who had been hurt terribly and had every right to destroy them in return. Instead, they had chosen another path. He told the council that the old ways had failed. Isolation had not protected them. It had only ensured that when conflict came, there would be no allies to help and no diplomatic channels to resolve disputes. The humans were offering them a chance to change. They would be fools to refuse. The council voted. The decision was not unanimous, but the majority accepted Olaf's terms. Descended from his platform to stand before. He was barely taller than her despite his species' usually greater height. Age had bent his spine. He apologized for what his people had done. The words seemed inadequate for the scale of the crime, but he offered them anyway. He said that they would honor the agreement. They would try to become better. Accepted his apology. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not hers to give, but she acknowledged that he was taking the first steps on a long road. The signing ceremony took place the next day. Representatives from both species affixed their marks to the documents that would end the war. News of the peace spread across the galaxy. The Galactic Union expressed surprise and relief. They had expected extermination, not reconciliation. Before leaving, they visited a site that they had prepared. It was a memorial to the 4 billion humans who had died on Earth. The monument showed human and figures standing together, looking up at the stars. An artist had designed it based on descriptions of human memorial traditions. Stood before the monument for a long time. She thought about her mother. She thought about everyone who had been lost. She thought about the long journey that had brought her to this place. The fleet began the voyage home. Fewer ships made the return trip. The war had cost hundreds of thousands of vessels and millions of lives. The price of vengeance had been paid in full. On the observation deck of her flagship, watched the stars pass by. Daniel Shaw joined her, as he often did during quiet moments. He asked if she thought they had done the right thing. Considered the question. She said that they had shown what happened when someone attacked humanity. That lesson would not be forgotten for 1,000 years. But they had also shown something else. They had proven that humanity could choose mercy when destruction would have been easier. She looked at the distant stars. Somewhere out there, Earth was slowly healing. Somewhere out there, they were beginning to open their borders for the first time in 300 years. The future was uncertain, but it held possibility instead of endless war. Smiled for the first time in over a year. She said that her mother would have approved. The fleet sailed on through the darkness, carrying 900,000 stories of loss and hope. Behind them lay the ashes of the past. Ahead of them lay the chance to build something better. Humanity had come seeking revenge. They returned having chosen to be something greater. That choice would define them for generations to come.